wait for people to come on in before we get moving. All right. We'll try and start nicely and on time because conscious everyone's very busy. So welcome everybody to this webinar on Thriving Kids, what it is and how it might work. I would like to acknowledge that I am coming to you today from Kaurna land and pay my respects to Kaurna elders past and present. And as part of my commitment to paying the rent, I always like to shout out to a piece of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture or work. And this week, we have seen the launch of Our Ways, Strong Ways, Our Voices, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Plan to End Family, Domestic and Sexual Violence 2026 to 2036. It's a cracking read, and we'll post a link in the chat. I really encourage people to go look at it because it's an example of a really deeply co-designed and come from community piece of work, thinking about a really complex policy issue. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caroline-Croser Barlow. I am a former public servant, including having worked on the Royal Commission into Early Childhood with the Honourable Julia Gillard, and I'm currently the CEO of the Front Project, which is a philanthropically funded think tank, and we work on early childhood systems. I am joined today by two of the fellow members of the Thriving Kids Expert Advisory Group, Skye Kakoschke-Moore, who I'm sure many of you know. She is the CEO of Children and Young People with Disability Australia, CIDA. And CIDA is the national representative organisation for children and young people with disability aged 0 to 25. Hi, Skye. And Morgan is the CEO of Koorana, Child and Family Services, a not-for-profit organisation that focuses on supporting all children of all abilities through early childhood intervention and inclusive preschools and broader family supports. Morgan also served on this advisory group as a lived experience parent representative. Now, so you've all come along because you want to hear about Thriving Kids. I should get my disclaimers out first. We are not here formally speaking on behalf of government or even on behalf of the Expert Advisory Group. We are just people who in the world thought it might be helpful if we came together and answered a few questions around the design and setting of Thriving Kids. So one thing I'd say is this is a really policy focused webinar. We're going to be talking about kind of system design and policy questions. We are actually all showing up at a kind of family focused webinar later on today. So if you're more interested in understanding things from a family perspective, if you are a family with a child who is currently in the NDIS or who thinks they might be using some of these services, we really encourage you to go along to that webinar, which will be a bit more relevant, and we'll post a link again to that into our Q&A. The other thing I wanted to say is that we're really keen to be able to answer questions, but I do want to acknowledge that feelings are running really high about Thriving Kids and about NDIS reform in general. And so just to set a few little ground rules before we move on, this is meant to be an explainer. It's a place to kind of talk about what's being proposed and why. It's not the place to argue about the merits or what you think should happen. We're not the government reps, we're not decision makers. I'm always very happy to have a longer chat offline and keen to hear people's perspectives, but we really want to keep this a kind of explaining kind of content. So please pop things in the Q&A, but if you disagree with something that someone has said in the Q&A or one of us has said, like, we don't need to kind of engage in that in this space. I think really happy to do that in separate places, but we want to make this a safe place for kind of shared sense making. And finally, I just want to say, one of the reasons why this is a hot issue is because lots of us have like a professional engagement with this, but like Morgan, also have a lived experience engagement with this. Like lots of us have personal experience navigating these kinds of issues. And it can be really hard to hear some of this, so look after yourself. And if you're finding it too much, like just turn off and ring us up and we'll have a chat with you afterwards, right? Like I'm here to chat. So anyway, those are all the disclaimers. We're going to start by just doing a little bit of a recap of how we got here and the process for the advisory group report. So I am going to throw to Morgan, who's going to talk to us about how we got here.
Thank you, Caroline, and hello to everyone today. Thanks for joining us for this. So I think just for those who are a little bit less familiar with the process and how we've landed with this Thriving Kids Advisory Report and the group as well, we just thought we would take you back a couple of years to October 2023. So you may recall after about a year of work, the NDIS review released its final report. And in that, it called out a lot of things that the sector had been observing, and a lot of opportunities to improve the experience for families, particularly in that early childhood space. Fast forward to December 2023, National Cabinet came together and they did make an agreement that they would commit jointly to funding the new foundational supports that had been recommended in the NDIS review. And that was really, foundational supports was framed as kind of filling the gap and kind of what was lost when the NDIS had rolled out, that there was kind of a gap for families that wasn't quite being met, and some families weren't able to access the NDIS for all sorts of reasons. And so there was this acknowledgement that there's a gap that we need to fill. Now, as part of that National Cabinet agreement, this was tied up in some broader negotiations that were happening at the time around hospital funding. And so over the last couple of years, since December 2023, when that announcement was made, those negotiations have been progressing, and they've been progressing in a range of different ways, particularly around that hospital side. So that there's two elements, and I think it's important to acknowledge that the delay in kind of landing this National Cabinet agreement has been incredibly complex for government. In that time, though, there has been an incredible amount of work. So DSS ran a range of consultations in 2024, and that included consultations with families, the sector, formal processes. States and territories have also been doing consultation work through that entire period as well, and looking at what would be the appropriate service model for their jurisdictions. Fast forward to last August 2025, Minister Butler announced the Thriving Kids program. And so that was the first time we had a name for foundational supports for children under the age of 9. He put that on the table. He had clarified a little bit of the cohort and what he saw would be most appropriate and what the Commonwealth was thinking around the cohort for foundational supports for children. He talked a little bit about funding levels from the Commonwealth and what he was hoping to achieve with the states and territories, and had offered some opportunities for Commonwealth direct delivery of services. From that point in time, our work really started. So the Thriving Kids Advisory Group was then announced in September. We had our first meeting, I think, at the 30th of September. And then we went into a very intensive 3 months of consultation. So we had several meetings in that time, but a number of deep dives that also brought in broader sector representatives, and some testing with lived experience representatives. Simultaneous to that, there was a parliamentary inquiry running at a Commonwealth level, also taking submissions. There were surveys and there was hearings, and they got through, I think, over 500 submissions in that short space of time. So those two processes were happening simultaneously. We were getting input from the parliamentary inquiry through our work. And just before Christmas, we landed our final recommendations in the form of the report that has now been released. Just after Christmas, we've obviously had National Cabinet agreement to progress with not only the hospital funding, but also the Thriving Kids Initiative and what that funding will look like. And we're now going into a phase where those bilateral discussions are happening with various jurisdictions, which is where the finer details are going to be knotted out. I think, and I suppose on the heels of that, brings us to today. The Thriving Kids Advisory Group report has now been released publicly. So our recommendations are now public. I think at this juncture, it's really important to note that this is a model that has been designed through a lot of consultation with the advisory group, input from the parliamentary inquiry, but the report itself is our recommendations. It's not the firm decided model that is in every detail going to be adopted. It's the recommendation. So I'll now hand back to, I think, Caroline or Skye to talk through the inputs.
Skye speaking. Thanks so much, Morgan, and thanks, Caroline. So as Morgan and Caroline have said, the advisory group was established by the government, and we were tasked with developing key components of a model for delivery of Thriving Kids across Australia for the states and the Commonwealth to consider. So while the advisory group timeline necessitated a rapid review of information and evidence, as Morgan highlighted, it's really important to note that we weren't starting from scratch because there was already a lot of thinking and work out there that we were able to draw on. So there was that prolonged process of consultation from 2024 onwards. Some of it was Commonwealth-based, such as the DSS consultation on foundational supports and the parliamentary inquiry into thriving kids. And there were state-based consultations too. So the advisory group tried to bring all of this information together into a proposed model for governments to work from in their own negotiations. So inputs for the model just over the last few months included some of that professional expertise. So for example, the advisory group were really lucky to have been informed by the new best practice framework for early childhood intervention, which was released in October 2025 and was developed by a consortium that SIDA was part of. And that consortium engaged in conversations and consultations with hundreds of professionals and families in order to design and bring this framework to life. The advisory group also did those deep dive sessions with professionals, so allied health providers, educators as well. A really critical input for the advisory group was lived experience. So, for example, the deep dives that Morgan and I have mentioned included participants from disability representative organisations, and there were separate focus groups held with families from diverse communities to test the model. So Thriving Kids advisory group members also informed their own contributions to our meetings through engagements with the communities they represent. So for example, because I was there on behalf of SIDA, I was able to use the results and analysis of our 2025 survey on Thriving Kids, which had more than 1,500 responses. So when I was attending these meetings, I wasn't attending them to bring my own personal perspective. I was there to bring the perspective of our community. The advisory group also looked at the Thriving Kids model through a systems design lens, which is all about like, how do we bring this together?
Brilliant. And I'll take over from there, Skye.
Thanks, Caroline.
And so what do we mean by kind of system design questions? So there's kind of the practice on the ground, there's what people experience in the kind of interactions that they are having with professionals, but then there's the kind of questions of how do you build a system that kind of brings all these things together. And so on screen you'll see this is just an extract from the Dana submission to the parliamentary inquiry, which I found a really useful kind of summary of kind of some of the system design questions you might have. So, you know, you can think about, are we designing a system that is consumer directed? And if so, you know, you're thinking about giving the money more to consumers so that they can go and make a choice, or are you designing a system that's government commissioned and that gives you a different flavour? Are you designing a system that's disability specific so it kind of sits alongside mainstream systems, or are you putting it in the mainstream systems? Now that's just one lens, which I thought was like a nice way of thinking about it. The other kind of big system design questions that kind of have been bubbling. So one, is Thriving Kids a single program at all, or is it a range of things? You know, is it going to be one thing or many things? Is it going to be the same in every state? Are you going to have exactly the same activities in every state, or might it look different? And if it looks different, what do we expect in terms of national consistency? Obviously, a big question is how do families access Thriving Kids? And what you'll see is that that framing of eligibility, which really comes from NDIS, as we talk through the model, is a little bit less helpful in the context of Thriving Kids when you think about how to access. And then how will you know the system is working? It's another big system design question that comes up. And finally, and I can see we've already got a good question on this from Erin West, what is the workforce? Like, what is your pipeline of the workforce for how you're going to support these? These are system questions. So they're not just like what is delivered, but how you deliver it. So, and then there are two system questions actually that weren't in scope for the expert advisory group, which report, but I do just want to flag them. They're the really important questions around what is going to happen to the NDIS pathway for early intervention, when changes are eventually made, and what will happen to support children who might exit the NDIS. So those questions weren't in scope for the advisory group, but again, they're the kind of system questions that might come up. So taking all of these inputs, the professional expertise, the lived experience, the thinking about system design, we've come together to devise this recommended model, which we're now going to pop on your screen, and Morgan's going to start to take us through.
So this is the busiest slide we have. Apologies, guys. It's really hard to fit an entire model onto one page. And so we acknowledge there's a lot on this kind of one-page explainer. What I'm going to try to do, my very best at, is to break this down and help you make sense of what's on this graphic. So at its heart, I think it's important to kind of start with the Thriving Kids model is designed to reduce barriers in terms of access to support for families. The entire design process was kind of thought through from a family journey perspective, and we kept coming back to that to test what would be the family journey through this. The idea is really that there's no wrong door and that anyone, including the child and family, can refer themselves for support. So really reducing all those steps involved in getting access to support. Another important point which the minister did confirm is that there's no diagnosis needed to access supports under Thriving Kids. So if you start to look at what's on the page here, there's effectively 3 layers of support we're talking about. And this is very much designed to be a stepped model where you step up and down based on need. On your left, you've got the universal supports. Those are intended to be for all families. So that is something that whether you're also getting NDIS or you're also getting targeted supports under Thriving Kids, the intention is that the universal supports remain available to you. It's not like you kind of graduate from that to another one and then they're no longer available. They're meant to always be available for all families. Within this, it's a range of things such as parenting supports and information and advice kind of at a very basic level, getting families access to information and advice in a very user-friendly way and a range of ways that's going to meet their needs. So you'll see one of the recommendations is that there's a phone line, that any family in Australia, if they've got concerns, can pick up the phone and speak to an early childhood specialist who can give them some advice and also help link them to the local services. That there be more online information, particularly that's targeted to autism and neurodevelopmental differences. It's a real focus on parent support, so peer support, family support, sibling support, trainings. And when we say trainings, we mean very kind of focused trainings, things like Hanan, things that are going to help build the skill and confidence of the parents and the caregivers sitting around the child that are evidence-based and really targeted to this cohort. Other group activities, things that are going to support the overall well-being. As I said, the idea is that this is universal, no diagnosis needed, no referral, you just can access this if you need it. The next layer, if you will, is what you see, I'd call kind of pink, dark pink on your screen, which is the targeted supports. Now, targeted supports is more of that individualized support. This is traditionally kind of your allied health. The sector calls it early childhood intervention. This is very targeted individualized supports for each child and family circumstance. Now, within the best practice targeted supports that we've recommended, there's a few things I think to call out. One is that we have recommended that be delivered by allied health professionals and early childhood intervention workers. Broadly speaking, we recognize that the ECI workforce is broad. We've also recommended that be a mix of group and one-on-one delivery, that it could be in person, it can be virtually. It really needs to be tailored to what suits the family and aligned to best practice. So where possible, we want to be in the everyday environments that children are, but we also need to tailor this. We don't want this to be a cookie cutter model where you get X number of hours consistently every week. Some families might need an intensive block and then that might drop off and they just do a touch base. They might circle back around. We've really, I think, in terms of recommendations, recommended a model that's flexible to suit family needs. Now, in terms of the layers of support within targeted, there's kind of 2 layers to this. So there's one which is really on the screen, it's described as lower support needs. I like to say it's focused. So where you've got a child and family that has a really focused need, The intention with that is that they typically need one type of intervention or allied health input. So for instance, a child who's having communication delays may see a speech therapist. That's typically going to be a more time-limited approach, that you receive that support and then you graduate from that. However, in some cases, it may be that over time those needs grow or become more complex or more obvious, and therefore the complexity and the multifaceted nature of needs may evolve. And so the second layer of that targeted supports is on the screen, it's called moderate support needs. That's where we envision families will receive a collaborative teamwork approach. And so the intention there is to say that if a family has multifaceted needs, they do need to be supported by a team around that child and family that has multiple disciplines involved. They might not always be needing input from all of those disciplines, but you want to have the input sitting around that child and family. And that is both of those approaches, whether you're getting kind of a really focused approach or you're getting more of a multifaceted approach with a collaborative teamwork model, both of those approaches are intended to be aligned to best practice. So really focusing on growing the confidence and the skill of the family. We acknowledge families have so much expertise already, but we want to help them to grow their confidence and skill level to support their child, so they're ready and able to do that. The third layer you'll see on the screen is, of course, the NDIS, and the NDIS is not going anywhere, as we know. And so the next step to the model, if you will, is for those families whose needs over time become more complex, or a diagnosis does come into play that is associated with more significant needs of support. And then, of course, a family could move into the NDIS if that's more appropriate, or they can start there. There's no intention that this is something that you have to go on a fixed journey to get to the NDIS. Some families will go straight there because their needs are significant. It really is all tied back, and the entire intention of the model is to be aligned to support needs holistically of the child and family.
So before we throw to Skye, I'm just going to call out Clara Abazu has asked a really good question, which is to understand the work happening around the definitions of mild to moderate and severe and which professions are expected to assess and assign those levels. Morgan, I'm going to have a go at reflecting back what you've just described in those terms, and then I think you and Skye should correct me. But I guess one way of thinking about it is that pretty much from here, well, from once this is fully implemented, the definition that will matter in that kind of context is the NDIS definition, right? So that is the one where meeting the specific level of severity is going to be, are you or are you not in the scheme? So once you get to, and I think there's still some discussion around what it will be, but it's like significant something, and anyway. The question around mild to moderate, as you can see from what Morgan has just described, and Debbie Williams asked a good question as well about, does universal mean universal? It does in fact mean universal. So when we talk on that very left-hand side of the thing, we talked about families for whom a diagnosis might never actually be what's coming in their future, but they might still benefit from these things now, because actually you can't tell with a given group of kids sometimes kind of what their trajectory is going to be. It's about giving them the help where they are and what they need. And then when you get to that best practice targeted supports, that's where I think the question around kind of what level of support might you need will be more required. Like there will need to be some kind of assessment about, do you get the moderate, do you get the more complex or the less complex supports? Morgan, do you just want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is an important question, and I don't know if we, as you said, we can't fully answer it now. So part of the work, as you said, is going to be what is the absolute cutoff with the NDIS. And Skye and I both sit on the Children's Expert Advisory Group with the NDIA, and that piece of work has happened, but it needs to be reviewed, and it's an ongoing piece. That's not finalized, and so that firm line for what's NDIS and what's not, that has to be defined. But as you say, if you're then in that low to moderate support needs category, based on where that firm line ends, what we've recommended as an advisory group is that there be a support needs assessment that's looking at the child and family's needs, and holistically, not just the child's needs, but the family's needs and circumstance and everything that sits around that. Do they have 3 children with a disability? Are they a single mom? Does the parent have a disability? Are they in a really remote area, all of the things that kind of come around kind of the complexity to the family circumstance, to then look at what are the support needs and what is going to be the best fit for those. So as I said, we've kind of differentiated that between, in the targeted space, is it really kind of one discipline that can support this family and that would kind of be, that's what they need, or is it that there's a more complex picture in front of us and we need to give them a more collaborative teamwork approach. So I wouldn't get too hung up on who's low, who's moderate. It's more about matching to the needs and circumstance of the family. Skye, do you want to add to that at all?
Skye speaking. Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, I'm really pleased that the language that's being used by the advisory group in our report, and also the language that's being used by governments, is being unpacked here. So you will have noticed that the government is using the language of a child with developmental delay and/or autism with low to moderate support needs. This language is being used because it was the specific language approved by National Cabinet. However, if you review the Thriving Kids Advisory Group's report, you'll see the advisory group specifically made note that the preferred language would be children with developmental delay and/or neurodevelopmental difference. That's because the Thriving Kids model is based on the assumption that no diagnosis is required, and it uses strengths-based language. Further, the advisory group recognises that neurodivergence is unique to each individual, and there's a broad suite of identities and needs, such as sensory processing, ADHD, and others. We also recognise that this language is better aligned to the National Autism Strategy. So while we're talking about this, I think it's really important to note that the language of low to moderate support needs, and that we clarify that this is not intended to map directly to a diagnostic level. So for example, autism level 1 is certainly not equal to low support needs, and autism level 2 is not equal to medium support needs. That's because support needs are unique to each child, their family, and their circumstances. And diagnosis should not inform support needs in the context of Thriving Kids. Support needs should be defined following an assessment of each child and their family's unique circumstances.
Brilliant. Thanks, Skye. That was super helpful. More broadly, would you be able to just give us a bit of a recap of what is most important to the families and young people that you've spoken to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Caroline. So at CIDA, we heard resoundingly that Thriving Kids supports must be strengths-based as well as disability and neuro-affirming. This was really highlighted not only by parents, but by young people who we've spoken to in the context of early childhood intervention. We hear stories from young people about the language used to describe where they were at with their developmental journey as being incredibly hurtful and really limiting their own sense of worth and also the development of their own identity. So for the Thriving Kids Advisory Group, it was really important for CIDA, and we're so pleased that the advisory group report reflects this, but that when we're talking about Thriving Kids, those supports really have to be disability and neuro-affirming and take a strengths-based approach. We also heard very strongly that families don't want to be forced into generic programs that don't meet their specific needs, and that the ability to access supports in a one-to-one or in a group-based setting is super important, because the supports have to work with the family and with and for the family's unique circumstances. We also heard that considering the needs of the whole family is essential. This was particularly true where families had multiple children who had support needs. And so the ability for that family to work together with support providers to identify how best to structure supports that work around the family's natural rhythms was really important. Families were also very concerned about changes to the NDIS in and of themselves, but particularly in the context of Thriving Kids, and whether those changes will mean their child is left without support. What we can say is that the government has said publicly that any changes to NDIS eligibility won't commence until Thriving Kids has been fully implemented, and that won't happen until January of 2028.
Brilliant. Thanks, Skye. Before we move on to the kind of what is the current state of play, I thought we might just take a few little from the questions from the chat. And Neva Paul has asked the good question that I noticed the model focuses on the family, equipping family, parents or caregivers to increase their skills or confidence. And she sort of asked, well, why do the parents have to take on this responsibility? Shouldn't the responsibility of learning and implementation of this knowledge rest with ECEC educators, teachers and allied health professionals? Morgan, I'm going to throw to you to talk a little bit about kind of that conceptualisation of early childhood intervention as a partnership with families.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question. And I think has caused fear both ways. I think that let's acknowledge that. I think because the model is new and not fully understood, I think there's fear both from the educational sector as well as from families about their role. And I think to explain what we mean by building families' skill and confidence and capability to support their child, it's what they do every day. So, if you go to your speech therapy session and you might have a session working on a lisp, let's say. And so one of the things that they might be working on with your child is how to tuck their tongue behind their teeth when they're using the DS sounds. That's something that if we only do that in the setting of that 1-hour appointment or 30-minute appointment, whatever it is, it's going to be hard for that child to really master that skill. In reality, that child is going to need to practice that, any opportunity that comes up. And so there's going to be some education for the parents in that setting to say, listen, when you notice them using the S sound, just gently show them how to tuck the tongue behind and remind them. And let's help prompt them until that becomes natural for them. And so when we talk about building parent skill and capability to support their child's development, it is that. It is literally helping them to know how they can just naturally prompt in the day-to-day. There's a lot of evidence around that, and it is actually in reality something that's quite natural and a role that parents already have in their child's life. It's just giving them the guidance to help make sure that is effective as possible. So I think that's a really important question to get on the table.
I might jump in if I can, Morgan, because you just reminded me of one of my favourite quotes of all time, and I heard it in the context of the young people study, which was conducted as part of the development of the new best practice framework for early childhood intervention. So this study involved interviewing young people who had experience engaging with early childhood intervention. And during one of the interviews, a young person said about receiving therapy as a child, make it a childhood memory, not a therapy memory. And so I think that just really reinforces what you were saying about the critical role that families play. Yeah,
absolutely.
I love that. That's beautiful. And there's a question in here about the upskilling and training of professionals in the ECEC and education spaces. Do we have thoughts on how to support that, and due to the increase in expectations for them to identify needs and support these children? We're going to cover this a little bit in our next steps, like what's the current state of play as well. But Morgan or Skye, do either of you want to throw in just any early thoughts on our conversations around this?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in a little bit there. And as you say, Caroline, this is something that we'll kind of talk about in terms of next steps. But understandably, educators, and we run to community preschool. So, I've had conversations with our own educational teams around what this will mean for their role. And so I think understandably there's worry about what that will be. I think what I would say for any educators on the call is this is actually what you already do. You know these children, the children in your classroom, what works best for them, their needs. The idea is that when you would normally kind of go, oh, listen, I've noticed this, and you have a conversation with the family, this is going to give you more tools to put on the table to support that family. So the intention is not that you suddenly have to do this full diagnostic assessment. The intention is that it gives you more tools to support that family that you're already working with and would already naturally be working with. So, you might be able to then direct them to call the call line or to check out a supportive playgroup that is not your average playgroup in the community. It's a playgroup that has allied health there, and there's an OT there every Friday. So that might be a good option for them. It will help give some more tools rather than more to do, hopefully. We also, I think Caroline will talk a little bit more to this, but one of the things that was a big part of our discussion is the support for the educational sector, particularly around kind of inclusion and strategies and how do we do that effectively. And so it's one of the key pieces that we see as critical to success, but is yet to be fully determined. And so I think, Caroline, you'll be able to speak a little bit more to that. But I think just to provide that reassurance that it's not intended that you've got to go off and get some diagnostic training or like, you know, the intention is that you have more tools in your toolbox.
Brilliant. There's a question around key workers. We will return to it at the end. I'm keen to make sure we cover the content going on. So just to sort of give us to where we are now, that is the kind of model that we have kind of proposed to government. And then what governments have done is they've gone and they've negotiated, well, they are mid-negotiations about what they're going to implement in response to this. So what is left to decide, I guess, after the National Cabinet agreement? So hopefully our next slide will pop up in a second. So you will have seen that in February, oh no, it's the 30th of January this year, National Cabinet met and they finally signed on the dotted line and said, right, we are committing to doing foundational supports for children called Thriving Kids. This agreement had kind of, I guess, 4 key things going on in it. One, the Commonwealth agreed to give over most of the money they were putting into the pot to the states and territories directly. So the Commonwealth is bringing $2 billion, the states and territories are bringing $2 billion. And what the Commonwealth has said is they're going to give $1.4 billion to the states and territories. Now, what that means in kind of practice, or for those design questions I was talking about before, is it really means that, you know, it's a strong signal we're moving to a largely government commissioned rather than consumer directed spend, right? Because the Commonwealth does things where they give you a voucher to go and buy stuff like Medicare or NDIS. States tend to commission services that you then go and access. So that's a kind of big clue as to what the future might look like, is that the large amount of money has gone to the states and territories. They also, and Skye's talked about this a little bit before, is they made some decisions about timing. So from the 1st of September 2026, they're going to start putting Thriving Kids things into the system. Now, these are entirely additive, right? So they're not taking anything away at this point. This is just they're starting to put stuff into the ecosystem. And so from the 1st of September, families in some places in Australia will start to see more playgroups, more access to child development checks, or more whatever it is that's being put out into the system. And then they've committed to having a kind of full rollout of Thriving Kids by the 1st of January 2028. And implicit in that is the idea that that is the moment at which the NDIS access point will change from 1 January 2028. But what they've said is that any kids who are in the NDIS on 1 January 2028 won't have changed eligibility criteria. They will be reassessed according to the current eligibility criteria. So they're kind of grandfathering in the kids who are in the system as at 1 January 2028, and any future changes come from there. In terms of what is left to decide, and many of these things I think will be decided in the bilateral agreements that are happening at the moment and that we expect to be landed by the 20th of February when the great state of South Australia goes into caretaker mode and such, you know, they all sign on the dotted line before our election. 4 key questions I think to look at. One is the balance between the universal and the targeted support. So, you know, if you think about that model before, the left hand and the right hand side of the diagram. So how much of the investment is going in each side? That's the first question, and we don't kind of have a clear sense of that. I have been thinking more and more, and really inspired, I think, by Sharon Goldfeld at Murdoch Children's Research Institute on this. Also, there's a question of how much you leave unallocated so that you can develop local solutions. So you don't spend it all up front, but actually you leave some proportion of money to kind of go and spend on what's happening in local areas that's responsive to local needs. So I think maybe I'm kind of interested, there are 3 buckets of money. I'm interested in seeing how they do that. So that's one big question that's unanswered. A second big question that's unanswered, and this goes to Erin's question as well, is what is the workforce development going to look like? So there's actually a really good discussion on workforce development to support in the Expert Advisory Group report, and I've popped the page numbers on the slide there. And that report talks about both short and long-term actions that can be taken in support of building out the workforce. And when we talk about building out the workforce, it's not just how do you have a pipeline of specialists. It's also about what's the model of practice that current specialists have been trained in. And if we're shifting to a different kind of model of practice, which is a little bit less standalone individual allied health practices doing one-on-one work and into something a bit different, how are you kind of ensuring that? And it's also about how are you doing the upskilling and the supporting of the mainstream professionals who now have, so there's quite a few elements in that role. This is on the list of saying it's the responsibilities are still to be determined, although hot off the press as of yesterday, I was watching estimates because I'm a nerd, and I saw the relevant First Assistant Secretary say this is one of the things the Commonwealth is planning on doing with its $600 million. So this is workforce developments on their side of the house. Third question is evaluation and learning system. And again, I think that will sit in the Commonwealth side of house. It's my pet love. Go read about it in the Expert Advisory Group report, but I won't bore you all with it now. And then the final one is the kind of really tricky one of the role of schools and early childhood education and care settings. So just to be really clear about what the report said and what it didn't say, what it said is that the Expert Advisory Group strongly endorses the importance of maintaining the primacy of education in education settings. Kids have a right to an education. They have a right to have a full education, and we shouldn't be sort of taking them off to do other things that aren't related to their education. That said, we recognise that kids are whole beings, and it's not like they have child development needs here and education needs here, and that often schools are already doing things that fall in this space of child development, and the report gives some really good examples of that. So in schools, you see multi-tiered systems of support. In SA autism inclusion teachers, in early years you see, kindy uplift, you see some of the really great multi-tiered systems of pyramid models in early childhood settings and whatever, and those all kind of blend some of the things that you might think of as thriving kids activities already. But the Expert Advisory Group didn't say, oh well, you have to go and do that. What it said was, should governments choose to do that, then you really need to think about how you do it in partnership with your local education leaders. And you've got to make sure that you fully resource the time of your leaderships, your teachers, your educators, so that it can be done properly, right? So there's an opportunity there, but it's also a recognition that that's quite hard. And so I think that's one of the questions that's going to happen is, will states take up that opportunity in relation to the school system? The Expert Advisory Group report also called out that the Australian government actually has more levers to access ECEC because it runs the Inclusion Support Program, which could be a kind of mechanism for delivering that support. And I note that there hasn't been much commentary on that, but again, that's kind of a space that's kind of sitting there. So those are the unresolved questions. I'm going to throw to my co-panelists to offer any comments they would like on those ones while I have a little peek at the questions.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, listen, I think those are the things that we're going to be watching closely as these bilaterals close. I think, as you called out too, that we anticipate that these services will be additive and dropped into the system, but that timeline and when and, and what it looks like jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there's no obligation that this is going to look exactly the same in every jurisdiction because the infrastructure is different. One of the things I always said, I felt like a broken record, but we want the the front door to look the same. We want families to feel like wherever they are, they've got access to the same things. But what is actually sitting behind that, the infrastructure that delivers that may look different in each jurisdiction, because that's the reality of our service system. So I think that's something that I'll be particularly keen to see how that lands, and it's likely to be different in each jurisdiction.
Skye, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Something that I've been reflecting on is the importance of the evaluation of thriving kids. And the government had said that they were looking to evaluate the program 3 years after it's been implemented. It'll be really important, if that's the timeline that they're using, that we don't lose the opportunity to do that iterative improvements based on feedback, based on experiences of families. We don't want to lock ourselves into a way of doing something if we recognise early on that it needs to be changed or tweaked. So I think the evaluation is going to be important for that reason, but also so that we can continue to understand the outcomes that children and families are experiencing based on their engagement with Thriving Kids supports and based on the changes that are happening to the NDIS as well. So there's a lot happening for families and with the systems, and the evaluation is going to be a really critical key in making sure we're continuing to invest money where it's having the best impact.
Yeah, and I think that that is the tension that will be underlying a lot of the kind of future rollout, because on the one hand, families are keen for certainty, and you know, politicians are keen for certainty, and on the other hand, there is we're doing something new. And so trying to work out what new and what works. And so I think that kind of the transparency and openness around that kind of iterative learning process will be really important. So just kind of doing an evaluation and saying, all right, now we're changing to this won't work. But if you're having ongoing conversations along the way, you can imagine it might work a little bit better. Now we'll just quickly flip through a slide which has just got the timelines for the next stage before we come back to some of the excellent questions. So just in terms of the timeline from here, so we've had our National Cabinet decision, we've got the bilaterals that are hopefully landing on the 20th of February, you've got the states starting to begin their commissioning pretty much from now, and we would expect to see states going and talking to their parts of the sector about what's going on. We know New South Wales has already issued an RFI, so you'd sort of start to see conversations happening now, rollout beginning 1 October 2026 and rollout concluding on the 1st of January 2028. Although this is where, to Skye's point, like when they say concluding, I kind of think like you've got beta version, you've got version 1 of Thriving Kids out on 1 January 2028, but you wouldn't want to set and forget that, would you? Because it's unlikely to be exactly the thing. If we'll bring the slide back up on the nice the recommended model slide back up, and I'll start covering some of the questions. So the first question, we've had a couple of questions about the role of key workers, and it's fair to say, before I think I'll throw to Morgan on this one, that key workers has been it's one of those things where everyone uses slightly different language and it's always a bit confusing, and people have quite strong attachments to what the particular bits of language mean. Morgan, can you describe kind of where the report landed and what you think the role of key workers might be?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. And exactly as you said, Caroline, I think there's different models of key worker used in practice, and that was really acknowledged as part of the design thinking that we did. And the consultation, we did, I think, 2 or 3 deep dives with 50, 60 sector representatives to work this piece through. And so I think what I would say first is really what's intended in that multifaceted level of support is that there's, as I said before, a collaborative team around the child. Now, we know that one model for collaborative teamwork is a key worker model, where you've got transdisciplinary practice, and there's a lead professional. One of those disciplines is the lead professional, who is the key worker, who helps to coordinate that team, who helps to translate the strategies from all of the different disciplines to the family, help the family with prioritizing which of those strategies they might, work through first and what's going to work best for their lives. And they're kind of the key contact and with the family to kind of pull that all together. That is one form of collaborative transdisciplinary practice. It is not intended that that's the only model of collaborative teamwork that a family could use or that a service could use. And so I think one of the things that has been recommended is that that's something that is seen as a good best practice, but not the only best practice. And it's, there's going to be, as Caroline, you mentioned before, a workforce development piece where there's going to need to be training, and these are different ways of working for a lot of professionals in the field. So there's going to need to be a journey we go on to help support the knowledge and expertise to do that. There's going to need to be, a look at the university curriculums and the new grads coming out and what they're being trained in. This is a journey for the sector. This is not the starting point. I don't anticipate that as of, 1st of January 2028, even after, like the whole transition period, I wouldn't anticipate that there's an expectation that everybody is doing key worker. I think that it's going to be a journey to kind of build that into how we work. And we will need to, and the advisory group was very clear, we need to be able to tailor the collaborative teamwork model to the individual child circumstance. I think we could talk for an hour on what key worker model is. So I'm going to refrain from doing that right now, and what was kind of outlined as the model for key worker, but that is articulated some in the report. So if that's something you're interested in, I'd encourage you to kind of just read through that section and like the different functions that are talked about. And there's a graphic that kind of summarizes that quite well. So I think if you want a little bit more detail on exactly the key worker model that we're talking about, maybe read through that in the report.
There's a great question here around family autonomy regarding the choice of access points, and the questioner has said, it's been a particular issue with current early intervention pathways, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, that they're kind of funneled into a culturally inappropriate service. Skye, maybe I might throw to you in the first instance to sort of talk a little bit about both generally kind of how we thought about choice, and then maybe specifically the kind of comments made around ACOs in the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Choice was discussed a lot, particularly by the families that SIDA are engaged with. And so the fact that we're talking about it here really underlines how important the concept is. What the Thriving Kids model proposes to do is ensure that families have options. And so those options might be for accessing one-to-one supports, group-based supports, being able to find those programs in different areas that suit you. So absolutely, choice and options were something that we had considered as part of the model. In relation to the ACO model, we had some fantastic input from the advisory group members about some models that work very, very well in Indigenous communities. And it was very important for the advisory group that the principles for Thriving Kids reflected the access to culturally safe services. And so that the need for cultural safety was particularly nuanced, I think, in the advisory group's report.
Yeah, agreed. And actually, just to shout out, there's a specific recommendation in the expert advisory group report that calls on governments to consider dedicating a proportion of the Thriving Kids funding in an ongoing way to provide sustainable funding for ACO-delivered hubs in this space, because I think one of the things, there's a bit of discussion around the challenges of continuity of funding for hubs in general, but one of the things that was like, this is a really early quick win that could be had out of this, is just to hive off the money and provide sustainment and ongoing funding for ACOs to work in this space, because we know they're doing a great job. Unless you had something to add on that, Morgan, I might throw to the next question, which is
I was going to say I might just add a little bit on that, because I'm wondering if part of that question is also just about how you get access, and it's not something we have spoken about, and I think it is something that's in the we're waiting to see as an outcome of the specifics that come out of the bilateral. So as Skye said, like the idea is that there's choice and that there's not one single entry point. As we were doing some of the design of the model, we talked about, for instance, GPs or maternal and child health being able to refer in. And certainly that support needs could be identified from anyone in that ecosystem around the child and family. But who that goes through, we don't know. And I think that may differ depending on jurisdictions. But I think the principle, I think it's important to note that the principle that is just loud and clear in the report and our advice is that there shouldn't just be one single pathway in. And I said this to someone yesterday, I think like as a parent on that journey, we all know when you have a negative experience, when you raise your concerns and then you're stuck. If that's your only person to go through to get access to supports, that's not something we want as part of the system. We want families to be able to go to trusted people and professionals in their lives to get that access. So I think I would be very surprised if that principle, given how loud and clear it was articulated, in terms of access point, if that got lost in the bilaterals. I think that was very clear in terms of the advice. So the hope is that there's multiple professionals that would be able to channel families into getting those more targeted supports. So I just think we hadn't quite covered that, Caroline. So I thought I'd just
No, I really appreciate that. And actually it comes a little bit to where fast running out of time, of course. There are two good questions on kind of service coordination for families. And so I might start with Jackie's kind of question around equity for rural and remote communities. So how might governments grapple with this idea that you have limited capability in regional and remote areas? Does this model help us think about how that's going to be managed as part of the planning for receipt of allied health in regional and remote areas?
I'm happy to take first go on that and then throw to you, Skye. Yes, we talked a lot about our regional and remote areas in the workforce planning and in terms of the design of the model. I think that was one of the reasons why key worker did come a little bit to the forefront. It's to find those individuals who we know exist in the system now who do have transdisciplinary skills. Often our key workers in practice are workers who have worked in collaborative teamwork for many years, and they've picked up a lot of skill and experience in doing that. And so they may be an occupational therapist, for instance, that has a lot of experience in feeding and how that kind of translates to feeding, for instance. And so they may have skills outside of their core discipline and training that they have picked up. And so one of the things that we talked a lot about in terms of workforce planning is how we can make sure we're continuing to attract and upskill and bring more people with those skills into the system, but also how we can use that as a model to help service areas that don't have enough supports currently. So, if you've got a highly skilled individual who has multiple skill sets around them, that reduces the need to have every single discipline in each region. So I think it's a really important piece. And as Caroline, the other thing I'd say to that is, as Caroline said before, in terms of the funding model, there's certainly been recommendation to look at local solutions. And so that this not be a blanket funding that's the same in every place, because we know that each community is going to have a different starting point and a different set of needs. So that was part of the recommendations as well.
Skye, I'm going to word you up that this one's coming to you. So Sally Moore has been asking some excellent questions about kind of how families will experience this. So, you've got a range of things that might be happening. How is this not going to feel like a burden of navigation? And the subpart of that is also if children are kind of getting something in a school, if either a direct service or they're sort of taking part in a classroom where the teacher has enhanced skills or whatever, how does that kind of connect back into the family as well? What sort of things did we say around service coordination and planning?
Yeah, service coordination and planning is something that I think all families who have experience with early intervention and trying to work with schools or their early childhood centre knows how challenging that can be. The advisory group was really mindful about the demands, I suppose, on the early childhood and school workforce, and balancing that with their responsibility to deliver education in their settings. The advisory group was really clear as well that we don't want a situation where schools turn into quasi-clinics where you might have supports delivered in a school setting or an ECEC setting, but the child is still removed from the classroom in order to participate in those supports. So we would like to see thriving kids delivered in a way that helps to build the capacity and understanding of teachers and early childhood educators without them feeling as though they have a burden now to identify developmental delay or concern and then address it on their own. Morgan mentioned earlier about there's going to be more tools in the toolkit for those that are in the lives of a child. So whether that's their GP, the family themselves, their teacher, there will be a whole range of resources available, including online, that families will be able to access. We also spent some time in the advisory group talking about the timing of some of these sessions. So needing to have children attend what could be quite intensive allied health sessions immediately after school or just before dinner might not actually work best for that family and that child's energy levels. And so the idea that we may need to take a more flexible approach to when, the time, the day that supports are delivered as well. So yeah, back to you, Caroline.
Yeah, and I think one of the kind of challenges with this is that there isn't going to be a neat and simple answer. Like there are some interesting reflections on how can we support allied health professionals to work differently in schools? How can we support schools to work differently with allied health professionals? And I think everyone recognises that these are questions of judgment and practice and making things easier. But what I know is when I talk to teachers and educators, I hear them saying they don't want to do work that they're not skilled to do, but also they want to help, right? Like, and that there are things that they know they can do if they have more time, if they have more space. And so I think that's going to be one of our kind of critical questions. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm so sorry that this time has just flown past. We will definitely share the slides. At this point, we haven't been planning on sharing the video, but we can go back and have a think about that. And please, if you have any questions, please flick them to info@theFrontProject.org.au and we will triage as we come. But thank you so much for such a fabulous session. Appreciate it.